There's lead in all these things, and it's so easy for a big company to not think of lead first and foremost when they go to launch something. Federal government would say, no level of lead is safe, no level of lead is safe, because you don't want to be caught saying that a level of lead is safe.
The most surprising items that you've found lead in?
Definitely was the baby bottles, and that kind of highlights the ineffectiveness of some regulations. It was titled My Heart Sank, and it said we found the source of lead that was poisoning our child.
Lead stays in the brain for 2 years, is that right?
Well, that's the half-life. It takes like 5 half-lives to get all of that out. Our bodies mistake lead for calcium, so when they see it, they hold on to it. They say, we need this.
Oversight or regulatory is there?
I mean, next to none. China really has enabled people in America to do work that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. They're ordering it from China, drop shipping them into Amazon, and Amazon has next to no controls. Preventable. It's 100% preventable. It's 100% preventable. That's the number one thing.
Eric, thank you so much for joining the Gut Check podcast. It's wonderful to have you. We're big fans of your work and all the advocacy that you're doing around lead detection. So would love to just start with your background. I mean, this is such an interesting topic and the work that you do is so specific. I'd love to just hear kind of what was the catalyst for starting to test for lead and ultimately creating your company.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Caroline. The background has nothing to do with lead, really. It just has to do with understanding that environmental toxins or things in the environment, if you don't know they're there, they're going to cause a problem, basically. Prior to making lead testing kits, which I started doing in 2019, I was making a drug testing kit. So if people had bought drugs from off the street, they didn't know what they were, they could get a color change and kind of understand what they were taking. Maybe they don't want to take as much or take it at all. And this was something that was already being marketed, and I was aware of its existence. And, I'm a big harm reduction guy in any facet of life. If people are doing something, might as well do it safe, otherwise they might die or not have a chance to change their behavior. So once I found that lead test kits were being sold by 3M under the brand name Lead Check, they were being sold for $5 per test. So I saw a good opportunity to make a lead testing kit that was way cheaper. So I figured out what chemicals were in there, and then I just started making them, marketed them as 10 times cheaper than Lead Check, but does the same thing. And I knew that everybody had vinegar in their house, so they can activate the test with vinegar. And that was a nice hack to allow people to identify lead on surfaces, really easily. And I right away got a review that, I love the review. It was a 5-star review, but it kind of made me sad too. It was titled "My Heart Sank." And it said, we found the source of lead that was poisoning our child. And since then, every time I get a customer service call, I would ask the people, why'd you buy this test? And they would invariably tell me most of the time that they bought it because their child had been exposed to lead and now they're trying to hunt down the source. It wasn't until I found out about this glowing lead test technology when I was really like, wow, this is the solution that has been missing the whole time. Then I really got motivated. I met a lot of parents personally who had lead exposure in their lives, and I learned that it really does cause a whole host of, trouble. It really derails people's lives. So
What are some of those symptoms? How does a parent know that their child has been exposed to lead?
you might have gastrointestinal symptoms, nausea, vomiting or diarrhea, um, general malaise, feelings of being unwell, the hyperactivity, the inattentiveness, not immediately apparent to parents, I don't think, unless you're looking for it.
Yeah.
You may notice like this kid is, out of control, but that kind of evolves over time, and like if you're exposed to lead today, does your IQ immediately drop? Not really. It takes 2 years for lead to clear from the brain. So the damage that you get from a singular exposure is going to take a little while to present. And, you can't really understand IQ levels of a 2-year-old
Right.
anyway.
Right.
So typically parents aren't even aware. But in the state of New Jersey, for example, there's 12 kids with an elevated level found per day. So
Yes.
it's, much more, it's probably hundreds in the country every day.
So just kind of backing up on a macro level, so leads, can be found in the air, it can be found in soil, water, even, inside our homes, which we'll talk about. I think that's a common place that, you're using these tests. Why is lead in everything?
It just has a lot of niche uses, and it's historically been very easy to mine. And so when something's easy to get a hold of, it has a lot of uses, it has a lot of economic like value, and therefore it has a large structure behind it that enhances its ability to be sold. Lobbying efforts, distribution networks, salespeople. So it's been in stuff for a long time, and it doesn't get taken out until something happens.
I think you just posted this reel like yesterday or the day before testing all of the different old mugs. Walk me through why there would be lead in your grandmother's mug, coffee mug.
Well, there would still be lead in many times mugs that are produced today because the Consumer Product Safety Commission only tests the inside of hollowware, which is what a mug would fall under. So there's
Wow.
technically nothing prohibiting like an adult use mug from being sold that is coated in lead. Um, it just, when you use high temperature like glazes, not necessarily high temperature glazes in the realm of glazing, but anything that is getting baked on, lead is going to enhance that. It's going to allow everything to kind of flow and set up a little bit better and probably prevent against some, it wearing off. It's just something else to throw in the mix. And what really is the case is, like I said, it's already in commerce, it's already being sold. So, why stop?
And then does it add kind of insult to injury in that, like, I know a lot of the glass sourcing and a lot of obviously all consumer sourcing is so reliant on China right now that we're pulling in. But what does that regulatory landscape look like when we're sourcing these things from China? They're probably going right into like an Amazon warehouse and then right into our homes. I mean, how much
Yeah.
oversight or regulatory is there?
I mean, next to none. And I wouldn't even say that it's, I guess, like China really has enabled people in America to do work that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. They're ordering from China, drop
Yep.
ship them into Amazon, and Amazon has next to no controls. I mean, those drug tests that I was making, they weren't even legal to sell. I was selling them on Amazon for at least like 6 months. So like Amazon doesn't really vet, the products that are sold there. There's just too many, and they're not, the police. They respond to regulatory pressure to keep stuff off so they don't get into hot water. But until that regulatory pressure comes, nothing happens. And the only way people are going to find out that there's a problem is reporting stuff on saferproducts.gov.
So is any level of lead exposure considered safe? And when, at what level should we be worried?
That's a pretty funny question because the federal government would say no level of lead is safe, no level of lead is safe, and like because you don't want to be caught saying that a level of lead is safe. If you keep your blood lead level realistically below 1 microgram per deciliter, you're probably not. As an adult, you're not going to be statistically significantly more at risk for elevated blood pressure because of lead or increased atherosclerosis, which leads to strokes and heart attacks. High blood pressure leads to cardiovascular disease, and that's at about 2.2 for adults, 22 parts per billion in the blood, or 2.2 micrograms in the blood per deciliter. Sorry. And for children, it's around 2 also is when you see the cognitive impairments start, and your maximum, like the loss of IQ isn't a linear line, so it's like a logarithmic line. So it gets steep in the beginning, and then it kind of doesn't go down very much after a certain point, and that certain point's like about 7 to 10 micrograms a deciliter is like when you'll get pretty much all the IQ loss that you're going to get. Beyond that, you could still have, catastrophic loss of function, but it's kind of hit or miss, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the level of nurturing in the environment. As does, there's a lot of confounding factors here. If you have,
Yeah.
as an adult, a high level of blood in your lead in your blood,
Yeah.
and you have otherwise good cardiovascular health, your blood pressure is in check, you don't have really high cholesterol, are you going to die of a heart attack because of lead? Probably not. It's probably not going to do anything to you realistically. Maybe some cognitive impairment over time. And as a kid too, when they do these big analyses of IQ loss, there's a lot of confounding factors, including, you know, parental marital status, smoking in the home, income, even location. And so all these things factor in. So as a parent or as a person, what you can do to offset your risk if you have been exposed is to just kind of beef up these other things in your life to kind of say, all
Yeah.
right, well, like this is something that happened. So like, let me offset that with X, Y, or Z.
I think you said that lead stays in the brain for 2 years. Is that right?
Well, that's the half-life. And to get
Okay.
from like a baseline level of a certain amount of something to
Yep.
next to none, it takes like 5 half-lives to get
Okay.
all of that out.
Wow.
And I don't know the rate of diffusion of lead out of the brain, depending on your blood lead level. I have no idea about that. Because you're not exactly allowed to cut into brains to test how much lead has left over what time period. So there's a lot of, like lack of data in many regards to something that we could have probably, if there was no rules or ethics didn't exist, whatever, maybe a computer could simulate this one day, but they haven't done any human studies on lead exposure. It's only people who have been exposed and they track those kids, the Rochester lead study, that was a huge one. Um, the first one to really prove that lead dust was associated with increased blood lead levels in kids, and then they tracked those kids for like 20 years and saw the outcomes. So those are really valuable, but they're the best we have. So exposure isn't the end of the world, but it is definitely something that can be completely avoided. And if it does happen, it can be minimized and its impact by just getting rid of the sources of lead.
When you say, lead poisoning is 100% preventable, what would your advice be to, let's just say, like a young family, right? If you were in their shoes, and maybe, difference if they're redoing an old house, right? That's a kind of a unique situation if they're redoing an old house that might have paint or whatever with lead in it.
Well, to preface this, I'm going to say lead poison 100% preventable today. In 1975, it was 100% unavoidable because it used to be in all the paint that was sold and the gasoline. It was in the air constantly, it was on every surface. All the food had extremely high levels of lead in it. Um, Today, it is 100% preventable if you know where to look, and you have enough time. You're not going to get poisoned by lead if you move into a house, you determine the age of the house. So, anything built before 1978 might have lead. The older the home is, the more likely there is lead. Lead-based paint is likely overpainted. There might be multiple layers of non-lead paint. So if you do test the surface and it doesn't glow, that doesn't mean you can just rip the walls out without testing again. You always should cut through all the layers to test that. If you move into a new spot, it was built before 1986, there might be a lead water service line that's located near the hot water heater. You could scratch that and see if it's soft, looks like lead. Then you know that you at least have to flush the water for a few minutes before you use it. So just be aware of the age of your house. For sure is number one. Number two is the be aware of the location of your house. If you live in an area that used to have heavy industrial activity that was right near a major highway, your soil probably has decent amounts of lead. It's always a good idea to grow crops in raised beds. Backyard chicken eggs are going to contain like 100 times more lead than a commercially farmed chicken egg. And that goes the same for the food that you grow in your own yard if you're not using soil that has levels of lead that are comparable to commercial farms. Every time you grow crops, it's going to reduce the amount of lead proportionate to what is going into the food. So it's not the best place, we're eating the food every time, but it's a little bit every time. It's not like eating soil is terrible though. So keep your kids out of dirt bowls or whatever they might play in soil wise. And the last thing is be aware of things you bring into the house. Those vintage dishes much more likely to contain lead. New stuff sometimes, home goods they clearly don't care about. They what I don't even know. They do no vetting of the stuff that they sell there compared to other stores, which have a lot of like common sense about this because you don't want to sell stuff like that. It's unsafe. And finally, like uh, hobbies that might be leady hobbies. So, like if you go diving, you might have a soft bag full of lead shot, and that's going to release a lot of like lead particulate. If you have a gun, cleaning the gun is going to release so much lead, it is insane. All that like residue on the gun is just coated in lead. So, be mindful about where you clean it when you come home from the range. If you have a job where you deal with paint, be wary that you're not tracking it home. Um, if you're just aware of the problem in a preemptive enough fashion, you won't run into trouble with it. It's very unlikely that you're going to encounter it out of the blue, and even in like a dietary sense. So, like spices, much more likely to contain high levels of lead. Cassava is probably the most like be aware food that you probably want to avoid eating anything
Cassava.
else. Yeah, it's a root vegetable and it's typically
Yeah.
grown in areas apparently that have, very high lead in the soil. I don't know exactly
Because
where it's grown,
cassava is
but
becoming incredibly popular in the kind of the health food movement now, instead of things like oats or corn, because of the glyphosate levels, right? So
yeah, and
some of
that's a
those
whole nother
glyphosate
thing. I
rich,
mean,
yeah, I know the glyphosate rich foods. So cassava, a root vegetable, one of many. Are all root vegetables more susceptible to lead content?
yeah, but if your root vegetable's been grown on a farm that's been growing root vegetables for forever in America. Probably not very likely to encounter it. If somebody starts a new farm of root vegetables in a soil that has 20 times more lead than the commercial farm, it's going to be at least 20 times more contaminated. And then the contamination is also going to be based on that particular fruit food's biology. I'm not an expert on exactly what I'm going to do a lot of food testing coming up,
Yeah, that would be
um,
interesting.
it's interesting because so there's the California Proposition 65
Yep.
rule, which
Yep.
mandates that anything that's likely to involve exposure to one of these toxins on the list over a certain amount is different for each toxin. For lead, it's half of a microgram per day. You have to put this warning on there. Whole foods are completely excluded from that because California's economy would be just so negatively impacted. All the vegetables and fruits that are coming out of California would now have a Prop 65 warning, or not fruits probably, but vegetables certainly. Anything closer to the ground is going to have more lead. So like your lettuce is going to have a lot more lead than an apple, and a beet is going to have more lead than that lettuce most likely.
You said you're going to start testing foods. What foods are you going to start with?
I'm going to just start kind of from like the staple foods that people are most likely to consume. Because the thing about food is understanding food, like levels of exposure from food is you're basically going to rely on somebody else telling you, oh, it's this bad or it's this bad, and everybody has a different perspective. Or you can make your own determination based on how much lead you're actually consuming in an amount. Just
Yeah.
like I can know how much, ounces of water I drink by measuring it. I can do the same if I know the amount of lead in parts per billion and the amount of grams that I consume. So if I consume 100 grams of something, that's about 4 ounces, and there's 5 parts per billion lead in it, that's going to be half a microgram of lead right there. Adults shouldn't consume more than 7.5 micrograms a day, and kids shouldn't consume more than 2.2 micrograms a day. So, that'd be approximately about a quarter of what a child should eat per day. But 100 grams of starch, let's say, is going to be like 400 calories. So, you know, if you follow that, and the potato is probably gonna have more lead than, a grain, for example. Um, so it's not that hard to stay below that. And, there's a 10 times safety margin there to get to 3.5. So I would say you're probably good up to like 3 times of that realistically. But if you already have an elevated level and you're trying to get it down, consuming low levels of lead from your diet is going to slow down the I'm not going to say excretion because 95% of the lead gets stored in the bones, but I think that's a pretty safe place for it to be stored. The bones are like a
99% of the
closet.
lead gets stored in the bones.
95%, but yeah, because calcium isn't, there's not that much calcium in the environment, right? So our bodies mistake lead for calcium. So when they see it, they hold on to it. They say, we need this. Absolutely. And lead does everything. It acts like calcium right up to the point where it really needs to perform the job. It's like you make a bad hire. The person's like seems really qualified on paper, and then you get them into the meeting, and you're like, what did you do? You didn't do anything right. You screwed this all up. What the heck? We trusted you. And that's exactly what lead does. So the body doesn't even fire it because it doesn't know that it's going to cause a problem until it gets right into the spot where it really critically needs to perform. And that's in the mitochondria on the electron transport chain. It's in the neurons. It modulates something called a calcium gated ion channel, which controls when neurons fire and when they don't. They typically get left on when the lead is there, and that causes the kind of like global activation of neurons, which prevents the synaptic pruning. That's where you get the IQ losses and the actual neuron death is that leaving them on. And the ADHD symptoms come from just the total activation, like a little puppy. Like you can tell this whole dog's brain is lit up when
Yeah.
it's like wagging its tail, looking around, smelling everything, jumping
Yeah.
around. We don't have the capacity to be on 24/7 like that.
What are some of the things that people can do when they have been exposed to lead to detox?
First thing is definitely stop being exposed. Stop using dishes, clean up the paint, cleaning up lead dust. You want to clean in one direction and not use paper towels. I'm actually just writing a guide today on how people can, you know, deal with the contamination and deal with all these problems. Doctors will never prescribe you like chelation drugs unless you're like so exposed, because these chelation drugs are so harsh. They strip out everything. It's almost like chemotherapy. In terms of what you can do dietarily, I guess in theory you could take in more garlic. The sulfur compounds in the garlic will do a good job of grabbing onto that lead. but good luck feeding kids garlic. The other thing you could do is modified citrus pectin, which is a kind of fiber that's been heat and acid modified to reduce its size. And that means it actually, pieces of it actually permeate your gut and get into your blood. And these will bind with heavy metals. And it's been shown to increase the amount of lead in your urine by up to 5 times in only a couple of days. So that's pretty good because you don't normally, pee out lead. And so, five times increase. I don't know what fraction of the total lead in your blood is going there, but that's definitely more than it was before. So, nobody's ever done any studies on blood lead levels over time with that protocol. And the sneaky thing trying to get that lead down is avoid it in your diet. Like I said, you can get away with up to like 3 times that recommended daily max for kids or adults, let's say. But if you already have an elevated level, every day you sequester some lead in your bones, you excrete a tiny amount, but it's like taking steps forward. But if you ingest lead, it's like you're taking 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So you're only taking 1 step forward every day when you really could be taking 3 steps forward because that's your body's like natural maximum. And if you take, garlic, a lot of garlic compounds, or if you take the modified citrus pectin, you can speed that up a little bit. In addition to like just avoiding the sources, whether that be environmental, strictly speaking, or dietary. And the citrus pectin and I guess the garlic, eating adequate fiber is definitely going to reduce the amount of lead that you actually ingest into your, body.
There was a study, and I think it was published in 2021, that showed there's this bidirectional relationship between lead exposure and gut changes, gut microbiome changes, which makes sense. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what you find on the lead exposure in food, and I think it could be another kind of tip of the iceberg for what's going on from a regulatory perspective right now, because we know that these unfortunate rates of autism, ADHD, ADD are just crazy growth rates that are not normal, and there's something going on. And one area that at least I haven't seen really addressed very clearly would be lead in food and what we're feeding to a baby and baby food. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see what you find, and just to kind of see what that will lead to from regulatory or otherwise changes that people will make.
Yeah. I mean, I that's really interesting that you say that, Caroline. I never really thought too much about the microbiome of the gut and the level of lead that it might absorb, right? Because you don't absorb the nutrients that the gut microbiome absorbs, you excrete it. So if you had bacteria and whatever's in there, gobbling up this lead at a heightened rate, you would wind up avoiding it, even if you were consuming it in your diet. And that's really interesting to think about. In terms of, like total population exposure from the food, it's lower now than it's been in 50 years. Every year it gets better on the aggregate. Not that it's not something to like be aware of, but I think that even when I find the potatoes have lead and there's this and that, all this stuff. Carrots have lead, broccoli, it's close to the ground. Spinach definitely has a lot of lead. What are you gonna do? Gonna eat sand? Gonna eat nothing? Gonna become a photosynthesizer? Like it's just a fact of life, and we're lucky we're not alive. I mean, I was alive 30 years ago. It's too bad for me because I got significantly exposed as a child, in gestation from my mom, and of course, just breathing the air and stuff. There's still lead gas being burned at the time in 1992. So it's never been, safer in terms of like general exposure, but it's still out there. It's not like it's like, there's like 500,000 kids right now on the books as having elevated blood lead levels. That definitely doesn't tell the whole picture. There's like a huge thing in the lead exposure, lead poison prevention is what they call it. It doesn't prevent lead poisoning; it just identifies cases on a case by case basis. And there's a huge thing about underreporting, a lack of mandatory childhood blood lead testing, and it's the whole industry has been super kind of like underserved because it typically relies on government funding, and there's not like a lot of money in doing free lead inspections with like high labor intensive methods. Like you have somebody with an X-ray gun that costs 30 grand, and now they're got to drive to the person's house. They got to spend time there. It's like, it's going to be expensive. You're going to have to, pay for their whole life basically. So, it's never really been like easy to reach the whole population. the government's not exactly so good at marketing. I don't know why. It's probably because they have no money to hire like really crazy marketers or something. But like, I think how hard could it be? But nobody's motivated to act like that, in a system where um, your individual contribution isn't going to be valued outside of your prescribed role. So that's where I think businesses, and there's some irony here too, because lead got into the stream of commerce strictly because of business activity. Like that's the only reason why, these toxins are being sold. Like, why is there glyphosate and everything? Because it's insanely easy to grow glyphosate resistant crops.
Yeah.
And there's like a huge
Yeah, and
monopoly on that.
they're subsidized. So, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Well, once you get big enough, there's no
Yeah.
stopping you. Once,
Yeah.
the lead industry, for example, was like, I think I can't remember the number. It was valued at like today's dollars in 1880s was $5 billion in the 80s.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's really insane, and this is so there's some irony there. So, as a business, I can reach everybody. Like everybody knows what a Dorito is, and that's because Doritos have money to advertise. Everybody knows what Red Bull is, even though it's not good to drink probably. So if everybody knows what Fluorospec is, ostensibly, everybody could say, all right, well, I know what this thing is that I have the capability to test, and I have the understanding that lead might be here, so let me test and not get exposed.
Eric, are there different variants of lead? When you're exposed to lead via the air or food or however, does that impact you different? Are there different dangers of different exposures?
Yeah, for sure. So you would either have inorganic lead salts, lead oxide, or organic lead compounds, and then there's basically two classes of those, which are either soluble ones and insoluble ones. So, um, or elemental lead. So you have lead metal, fishing weight, for example. That's going to come onto your fingers. That's going to dissolve easily in your stomach acid. Then you have the lead salts. They could be soluble or not. The lead in the air is going to be lead chloride and lead bromide that comes from the combustion of the lead in the gas. You would think it would turn into lead oxide because it's burning, but that would like clog up the engine. So they put chlorine and bromine compounds in there to like attach to the lead, and then it comes out as lead bromide and lead chloride, which are semi-soluble in water. Not the best, not the worst, I guess, but you're gonna absorb them. And then you have like organic compounds. So like, for example, paint, white lead paint, that's lead carbonate. And so that's going to dissolve in your stomach acid pretty easily, but not as easily as lead acetate, let's say, or tetraethyl lead. Those are really dangerous, but you would never encounter them as a normal person. Like there's nobody. Lead acetate is like going to go through your skin, but you're not going to touch it ever. So typically, when you find lead in something like salt, it's probably lead bromide or lead chloride. In the ceramics, it's going to be lead oxide, most certainly. If there's adulterated spices, it could be lead chromate. That's a mostly insoluble lead salt, although the chromium is hexavalent, so it's also like bad chromium. Also, chromium is actually a low-key risk in food for sure, especially in spices. Spices, if you don't get your spices from a good source, I wouldn't get them.
What would be considered a good source of spices? And then why is there so much lead in spices? Like things that are very common, like cinnamon.
That's a tricky one. I guess like McCormick, I don't know. Like I'm a big fan of McCormick because I know somebody who he's a like trace analysis seawater researcher. So he's a real psycho. He really knows how to find the absolute lowest amount of lead in the most craziest, annoying to get to conditions. He's a real master. And he's talked extensively with people from McCormick about the global kind of supply chain of spices, and they seem, and I trust him like implicitly, that he knows what he's talking about here and he wants to do the right thing. And he says that McCormick is like, the probably the best people out there for like caring and having like internal testing that like they're not going to share with you because like there's probably some lead in everything, especially spices. I wouldn't trust a company whose address is a house. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like I could make a spice company, right? I could find some spice on Alibaba, I could order a ton of it, I could bottle it, and I could put it on Amazon. I would buy something from a company that you trust, and that's going to be variable, based on what you believe. But Consumer Reports also did do some testing on spices. They did a bunch, but it was like they were like, yeah, this spice has 1.2 parts per million. That's good. But, like, that was just the best that they found, but 1.2 parts per million is 1,200 parts per billion. That's not good. That's terrible. That's so much.
That's
But
right.
the caveat there is you don't eat a lot of spices by weight.
Yep.
So you multiply the number of parts per billion by the amount of grams that you eat. So if you eat 1 gram of cinnamon, I feel like that's a lot of cinnamon.
Yep.
There's probably only 5 grams in one of those heaping tablespoons that if you remember people do the cinnamon challenge. There's like
Right.
that's seen in a different light today,
Right.
probably. You're probably gonna get a lot of megadose of lead. But even if it's 1,000 parts per billion and you only have 1 gram of it, that's only 1 microgram of lead. And like, are you gonna eat more than 1 gram of these spices per day? Probably not.
What are the craziest items? What are the most surprising items that you've found lead in?
There definitely was the baby bottles, and that kind of highlights the ineffectiveness of some regulations in all cases. And there's a little blind spot with the baby bottle. Since it's a product for use by children, it gets tested in a certain way. So they break it into dust, basically, and then they mix the dust up, and then they scan it. And then the allowable amount is 90 parts per million, which sounds low. That's the limit for paint today, for example. But paint is already mixed up. So when you have something that has a exterior coating and the rest of it is glass, and the coating comprises like 0.01% of the total weight of the object, even if it's pure lead paint, it's going to get mixed into the entire thing and then diluted. So it will pass. So those baby bottles probably aren't even illegal, even though they are like uncouth, they're not kosher, they're not
Right.
safe. So that was an interesting one. There's a little bit of a variant of that. The Haya bottles that I tested as high as a children's vitamin company, and they had lead all over the outside. And yeah, of some bottles, like it wasn't like every bottle, but they had like one batch of bottles that had lead.
Aluminum bottle or is it a plastic
No, it was
bottle?
a glass bottle with a yellow coating. I don't have one around
Okay.
here, but um, they had done this. It was crazy because they tested it with that interior leach test, so it tested negative because the interior is blank. It's just glass. But they had done all this marketing where they show the kids holding the bottle. And then they wound up deleting all of those images off their Instagram. It was
Oh,
insane.
wow.
And then they sold the company for $200 million. And they sent me this crazy cease and desist letter. They were being really aggressive. And I
Wow.
was even more aggressive, actually. I called the lawyer. I recorded the call. I posted it the next day. I'm like, yo, what's up,
Wow.
man? Like, talk to me directly. I want to talk to you and the owners right now. And they didn't do that, obviously, because I would have just flipped out and probably recorded it. And
Wow.
so, there's lead in all these things, and it's so easy for a big company to not think of lead first and foremost when they go to launch something. And I'm sure you know this, like time to market is probably the biggest indicator of success. If you wait 5 years to launch your idea, somebody else
Yep.
will launch it.
Yep.
So, in this kind of rush, it's easy to have lead be the last thing on your mind because I never even think about it in my daily life anyway. It's been banned for so long. The older generations, the medical institution, which is kind of skews to like the past a little bit, all kind of treat lead as if it's something that, you know, poor, impoverished people get exposed to, which historically is like principally true, like on the mass scale.
So let's talk about the retail stores because those are the other videos of yours that I just love and I think are fascinating. So you'll go in, for anyone who's not familiar, Eric will go into a retail store like a Home Goods and he'll just walk around with his testing kit and test different items. What retail stores have been the worst and what has surprised you about these common everyday items that are just sitting on the shelves of these stores that have lead in them?
I think Home Goods was definitely the worst. It just seemed like because they have collections of plates from kind of like one manufacturer in Portugal, one was in the UK, one was in France, and it seemed like that was that little like kind of like niche of like items that were just like it was just like a free for all. Like I scanned the stuff in my XRF gun also, like they all had a lot of lead. I don't think they probably went through the proper testing because I think they would have failed.
From a supply chain standpoint, are there kind of the big offenders, like for example, to just call out China because that is such a huge partner from a manufacturing perspective for the U.S. But is there a correlation there between products that are made in China versus made in the U.S. and lead?
Yeah, probably. I would say yes, almost certainly, because like, if you're an American manufacturer, like what the hell are you doing putting lead in stuff? Like
Right,
really, like
right,
it's like it would be so insane, unless you're making, batteries, but even the battery manufacturers of America, like not safe places to work. One
yeah.
lady had brought the test to her job and they said, "Don't bring this here." is banned from the premises because she's found glowing lead on the doorknobs, in the break room, in her locker, inside her mask. And she had an elevated level. It was like 17 micrograms per deciliter. That's pretty high. Like furniture from Wayfair
Mm-hmm.
goes like white, like almost like Kia style things.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the edge binding or whatever you would call it, like the plastic strip on the edge, sometimes that has lead. Sometimes it does
Interesting.
flake off too. I found a few
Yeah.
of those last year that had lead.
Well, how can people find your tests? What do you recommend if someone's just curious and, has listened to this and they're like, I want to be testing my environment and items that I'm using every day for lead? How can they get started? How would you recommend them to use your tests?
Well, just know the age of your house, know if you like realistically even need it. Like if you have a house built in 2019 and you don't thrift and you buy your dishes from IKEA or Target and don't collect old mugs, like you probably don't need to test anything. But if you have some vintage bowls around, you have a house built before 1978, that might be important. If you're thinking about gardening, you want to just use this dirt you have in your backyard. I have a soil test kit in there also, all on detectled.com, and the Instagram is at Eric Everything Led. Um, so we'll see. And yeah, that it's 100% preventable. It's 100% preventable. It's 100% preventable. That's the number one thing. And it doesn't have to it doesn't have to derail somebody's life to find out about lead. And like I'm obsessed with lowering the costs of knowing. And like that's not just the actual physical like money cost, it's like the psychological cost. You find out that you have lead in your house before you get lead poisoning. It's going to be a lot easier to deal with than if you find out months later and now you have to leave the house, the renovation gets canceled, it costs more money now, it's like the government's showing up. It's like for so many people it's been such a nightmare.
What have you done personally since you have been so educated about all of this? What type of testing, what types of things have you done personally within your own life, in your house? Any changes that you've made?
I definitely the sink thing. If you have an older tap, don't just use, you gotta let it run for a couple seconds. You don't want that high lead brass touching your, that's something I do every time I use the sink. I'm like, I'm all
So
right,
just walk
I
everyone
can
through
wait
that.
for.
So you just turn it on, let it run for a few seconds before you use it.
Yeah, and if you do have a lead water service line, when you turn it on, let it run, you have to let it run for like 2 minutes. Don't use the hot water because then that lead water is going to go right into your hot water tank and it's going to hang out there and it's hard to flush out all the water from your hot water tank. So use the cold water, 2 minutes, get it out of the system, and then you can just use the water like normal. I do that. The spices that I eat. I used to be big like Indian food eater. I'm like, I don't know. There's no idea what they're putting in that, or like a lot of cinnamon. Like kind of avoid the cinnamon too. Dark chocolate. I was never a fan of it, so it didn't really affect me. But
Dark
I would be
chocolate
like, yeah,
is an
dark
offender?
chocolate. Yeah, dark chocolate's a pretty big
Oh
offender.
man,
I mean,
this is
like, it's
this
not
is a
like it's
bad
gonna
note
give
for
you
me personally to end on. Oh no.
yeah. And some of the lead stuff is kind of like a bittersweet, no pun intended,
Yeah.
aspect to it where you're like, I kind of wish I didn't know. And like in many
Is it the
cases, it's like
quality of the dark chocolate?
it's hard to really say because it's highly dependent on the exact circumstances of its manufacturer.
So
So
I've
like
got to just
cocoa
start.
bean.
I've got to start lead testing all my dark chocolate, is what you're saying.
Y- Yeah. Well, yeah. And Consumer Reports did some testing on that. I'm sure I'll do some testing on that. I was just trying to do this last year, and the testing procedure is a little bit more involved than I wanted, and I exploded my microwave. The high pressure nitric acid, hydrogen peroxide in these sealed vessels, and it's like goes up to like 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's high pressure. But you're supposed to pre-digest them, so a lot of the carbon burns off before you heat it up. But I just popped them right in there. I was so excited that it just exploded, and it was like, expensive and scary. So then after that, I was like, oh, this is like a nightmare. It was way harder. And like that's what I learned first and foremost is like the X-ray fluorescent spectrometry, the you know, ICP-MS or the AAS like detection technologies, like they're really involved and they really are like not bleeding edge science, but like they didn't even exist in the 1960s. Like they barely had the ability to see levels of lead in blood that would like you would be like, wow, that's different than that because it's so small. 1 part per billion, if you look at the human population, is only 8 people out of the whole population of 8 billion
Wow.
people. So, when you talk about the reference level is 3.5 micrograms a deciliter, that's 35 parts per billion. What is that? 35 times 8, that's like 250 people out of 8
Right.
billion. Like that's
Right.
still not a lot of people. So,
No, it's so small.
Trace detection is hard. You're unlikely to get poisoned by trace amounts of lead in your food. You're more likely to get poisoned by gross amounts of lead from your paint in your house, from a dish that you eat off of, from some hobby. Cleaning the gun on the kitchen table is not a good idea. And those vintage, distressed kitchen tables, sometimes they are actually vintage and they do have lead. So if you have one, test it.
Awesome. Well, cool. This has been great. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know this is going to be incredibly helpful to everyone who listens. It's an awesome conversation. Thank you for the work that you do. I think it's incredibly valuable. Definitely curious when you start testing food, please test the dark chocolate. I'm curious on that one. And I think the food testing will, again, just be very insightful, provided the day and age that we're in and how much awareness there is right now around food and the quality of our food system.